What, so what, now what? Session 4 of our course on Methodist history and theology. And this session is called Methodism Goes Global. So, basic question, when John Wesley died in 1791, where do you think most Methodists lived? You might be tempted to say Britain, but actually the answer is elsewhere. Today, some of the strongest centres of Methodism are in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But back in 1791, actually, it was in the United States where we see the biggest groupings of Methodists. The movement that began amongst miners and labourers and ordinary people in 18th century Britain has become a truly global church. Indeed, some would argue that the future of Methodism now lies largely outside of Britain and North America. So, in this session, 3 questions really. What happened when Methodism left Britain? Secondly, what can we learn from Methodists around the world? And thirdly, what might that mean for our own churches today? So, number 1, America. Methodism learns to adapt. The first great expansion of Methodism was into America. After American independence from Britain, Methodists found themselves in a completely different environment from England. There were vast differences, scattered settlements, and very few churches. And Methodism thrived in North America because it was flexible. It was based around small groups. It was based around what was happening in people rather than structures and some sort of outside authority. Certainly not British authority in a post-colonial America. So Methodism thrived because it was flexible. Instead of waiting for people to come to church, circuit riders, as they were called, travelled hundreds of miles on horseback, bringing the gospel to ordinary people. They also employed a mechanism called camp meetings that attracted thousands. And indeed, because of that, Methodism became the largest Protestant denomination in America very quickly. And incidentally, what we looked at last time about primitive Methodism was an import from North America. Lorenzo Dow, who came over from North America, part of this camp meeting movement, sort of remissioned England after Wesley, based on models that had developed out of Methodism in North America. Interesting sort of exchange between North America and Methodism here in Britain. But America also changed Methodism. Some things were gained, there's no doubt about that. There was powerful evangelism and focus on evangelism. There was a strong emphasis on lay leadership. There were very few ordained people. There was great adaptability, and there was a missionary vision for not only their own context, but for elsewhere, very soon going into Southern America, but then into other parts of the world. But some things were lost very soon. First of all, regular class meetings, whereas the first sort of meetings of the conference in the early years insisted that a Methodist member, like in Britain, had to be a member of a class meeting, soon that was no longer a requirement. Because what was happening was they were gathering in larger congregations in the new places that the circuit riders went to and set up communities there. And so therefore we lost the regular class meetings in exchange for big congregations. And we also lost accountability groups. And we certainly lost something of the ecumenism and the link to the Anglican Church that we had in Britain. And we also lost something of what had been what you might call Wesley's liturgical vision of the Methodist Church in America. He really gave them a reduced version of the Book of Common Prayer and a number of his sermons and other resources that would resource their life in worship. But they discarded it pretty much quickly, right away. Some of the disciplines that had shaped early Methodists as a renewal movement were abandoned very quickly as they established themselves as the main denomination in North America. By 1866, class meetings were no longer required for membership. So what? Well, the question or a statement that might be made is that they grew very quickly and strategically big numbers in terms of the percentage of the population and certainly in terms of the whole Christian community. But growth alone, perhaps, then numerically, is not enough. Wesley certainly had his eye on, if you like, spiritual growth and on holiness and perfection, as he called it. Wesley wanted not just converts, he wanted disciples and people who turned to Christ. He delighted in those greatly. He wanted people to turn to Christ, but that was only the start of the journey. And that seems to have been forgotten in the North American context very quickly. But a question for us, before we get too glib about our American neighbours, what is doing the work of the class meeting in our churches today? Certainly the group that I've been sharing this material with is becoming, or is, an expression of the small group and the class meeting in terms of the setting I'm in ministering to. But what else do we need to do to resource people in their discipleship and help them grow, not just as members of a church, but as disciples of Christ? And if people attend nothing but worship and they're not growing in their faith, are we producing disciples of Jesus or simply congregations? So that's the first thought, really, which is around Methodism learning to adapt in America. I think the other thing that has to be said about North America is that there were some painful lessons along the way, and something about the compromises that the church can go to. American Methodism teaches us a harder lesson. The earliest Methodists in North America, like Wesley back here in England, opposed slavery. Yet as Methodism grew wealthier and more respectful and respectable, it gradually compromised. Eventually, the church would split over slavery, and black Methodists formed their own denominations when they were denied equal treatment. So what was going on culturally in North America in terms of the North and the South, the Democrats and the Republicans and all that got mirrored in the church. And whereas one of the originators, Francis Asbury, in North America would have said, I can't see how someone can go to heaven when they own slaves. That attitude was soon challenged by those who in the South felt it was perfectly fine. One of the greatest Methodist leaders in that generation, Richard Allen, helped establish the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was one of the strongest forms of Christendom, or of the Methodist Christianity, right up until this last century, when they joined up again together, when a new cultural climate had been achieved. So what? Well, being Methodist does not automatically make us right or faithful, and churches can drift and churches can absorb the prejudices of their culture. Every generation must ask, where are we accommodating ourselves to society rather than being transformed by the gospel? That's as relevant in Britain today as it was in America then. More recently, I found myself being challenged by a member in one of my churches who was looking at the situation in Iran and saw perhaps that what America was doing was a good thing. Whereas I think the dominant feeling in the nation and in the church in this nation and across Europe is that war was not necessary here. It is an unjust war, and actually, America's actions were not warranted or defensible. So to find a Christian who felt differently and felt supportive of the Trump regime was a bit of a shock. But we don't always agree, and as we said previously, we do share contradictory convictions about all manner of things. We saw that 5, 6 years ago when we were having the conversations around same-sex marriages and human relationships and so on. And we arrived at a place where we had to hold two things in tension: a traditional understanding of marriage, and also an understanding of marriage where it could be between any two people who love each other. And then each local church had to make a decision. And some people felt that was incorrect and left the Methodist Church at that point, and others felt it was right and still find it difficult to live with that tension, living with contradictory convictions. But nevertheless, the important thing here is that, when we were having those conversations, we had to discern together as a church, as we conferred together and sought God together. Despite our contradictory convictions, we had to come to a mind that said, do we stick with the traditional view, or do we recognize here's a place where we need to repent? We had to make a choice. Do we repent of where we'd been, having got it wrong? Or did we have to say, actually, to the nation, we see things differently? Every situation is different, but there's a question about whether we accommodate ourselves, or whether we are transformed by the culture, or whether we transform it. The third thing then to move on to is Africa. And I think there's an interesting journey that's taken place in Africa over the years, that it's gone from being the mission field that the missionaries went to being the centre of mission, from the now the sending church. Perhaps the most surprising development then is Africa. Many British Christians still think of Africa as a mission field. The reality is very different. Some of the highest concentrations of Methodists in the world today are now found in countries such as Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, South Africa, and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland. They're bigger than us in Britain. And one fascinating theme runs through the Africa story. Often the missionaries arrived, we've arrived, the Lord has sent us from Britain to convert the heathen Africans, and to which they found people were already Methodists. Why? Because people had gone out from these shores as traders, as sailors, as soldiers, as business people, as travelers. Whatever reason they went, and they took their faith with them, and they had an impact. So the missionaries again went and said, we have arrived, and we've brought God with us, only to find God already there. People had heard the gospel, shared it, gathered others, and formed communities before official church had arrived. The church frequently spread through ordinary believers rather than official structures. I love the story of Thomas Birch Freeman. Freeman helped establish Methodism across large parts of West Africa. What made him distinctive was his willingness to identify with local people rather than simply impose his British culture and try and convert the heathen, ignorant Africans and give them a better way of life, which was basically meant be like us in Britain, the dominant power. Too often, this was a major issue, that missionaries exported British culture alongside Christianity, and the result was that sometimes people confused the gospel with European customs and ways of being church. I was sharing with the group when I was in the session the other evening that when I visited Zimbabwe in 2003, the two Methodist churches in Mutare on the Mozambique border, both Methodist church, one UMC based and one originating from the British Methodist Church, both of them European style buildings and organs and pulpits and straight pews and everything that you'd expect in a North Atlantic context. And it was only when I was in a prayer meeting, an all-night prayer meeting, where the the African congregation got back to who they were, and we started to see their culture coming across in their worship and in their praying and in their preaching, that we saw something really authentic there that wasn't dependent on the Western church sharing its culture as well as Christianity. So that begs a question then for us. What is essential to Methodism, and what is simply British culture? What can we lose, or what do we need to retain that means that we're still a Methodist people? I was challenged a few years ago when I was doing a previous piece of research in 2018 about the circuit system. I've always been a great champion of the circuit system, feeling that it's one of the things that makes us distinctive and unique. But actually, many Methodist churches, especially those planted by the UMC, don't have a circuit structure. It's not necessary to Methodism. It should be a scaffold for growth. That's what it was originally designed to be and often was. But what if it becomes a container of decline? Good questions to ask, challenging questions to ask. And when people enter our churches, are we inviting them into the gospel? Certainly the experience in America and the emphasis in America and in the African churches is one where evangelism is much more confident than it is here in Britain. Are we inviting them into the gospel, or are we inviting them into a particular way of being British? Those are not necessarily the same thing, are they? Let's move then across the ocean to Asia and think about the gift that Britain lost. And I want to particularly go to South Korea. South Korea didn't have any Methodism until the 1880s. But today, the Korean Methodist Church numbers around 1.5 million members. By comparison, in Britain, we have just under 200,000 members. So a fraction of the size of the Korean church, which isn't as old as us, didn't come along until about 100 years after Wesley. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is this: Korean Methodists kept the class meeting. While British Methodists largely abandoned Wesley's small group structure, Korean Methodists retained it and made it absolutely core and central to their life together. The result was a church capable of surviving occupation, war, division, and rapid social changes. Well, so what? Well, sometimes other parts of the world preserve treasures that we've let go, let slip. The global church may have something to teach us. Perhaps renewal in British Methodism will not come from inventing something new. Perhaps it will come from rediscovering something old. And so often we as British Methodists have a patronizing attitude towards people from what we used to call the third world, but now we call it the global south or the majority world. And, we need to be a bit more humble and realize that, yes, we have a rich heritage and we've got much to share, but boy, do we have a lot to receive as well. And we're not the dominant partner. Let me go across from Korea now to Latin America. In Latin America, especially in Brazil, Methodism developed a strong concern for the poor. Brazilian Methodists often describe themselves as the church of the poor, and they have insisted that personal faith and social justice belong together, are inextricably linked. And hang on a moment, doesn't that sound very like John Wesley that we've described in recent weeks? John Wesley preached conversion, but he also campaigned for social change against slavery at the end of his life, establishing schools, caring for the poor, speaking out against injustice. And, in one sense, the Brazilian Methodist Church echoes what is going on in the church missionally across Southern America, with the whole liberation theology movement of the 1950s, 60s, and right through to present. You'll find similar emphases in other Christian denominations as well. But then come back to Britain, and often we ask the question, should the church focus on evangelism or should it focus on social action? And the Latin American Methodists would simply say, yes. we certainly should have both. Their personal holiness and social holiness belong together. But then come right back closer to home and come into mainland Europe, where Methodism has never been particularly big and where it has always been a minority church. Methodism has often lived as a small minority church across all of continental Europe, and it survived a number of challenges: state churches who didn't want them, persecution, war, fascism, and communism, of course. Again and again, ordinary lay people kept the faith alive. And one lesson stands out: Methodism has often been strongest when it knew it was a minority movement. So what? Well, British Methodism is no longer a major cultural force, even though we pretend sometimes that we are, or think that we are. That can feel discouraging, but perhaps it also places us closer to our roots. Wesley began as a movement on the margins within Anglicanism. Maybe the future lies not in recovering former influence, but in rediscovering faithful witness. Maybe the answer is not to try and get big again or even just maintain what we've got, but to try and get smaller as soon as we can, to allow the farmer to do the pruning, the vine dresser to do the pruning of the branches. Now what? Well, there's really three challenges here at the end of the session. One is we need to learn from the global church. For much of our history, Britain was the sending church, sending missionaries all over the world. And today we need to be on the receiving end, and often are. African, Asian, and Latin American Methodists have many gifts to offer: passion in worship, confidence in evangelism, commitment to discipleship, concern for justice, expectation that God is still at work. The global church is not a pupil, it is a teacher. Secondly, we do need to recover small group discipleship. One of the most consistent lessons from World Methodism is the importance of intentional discipleship. Where class meetings or small groups survived, Methodism often remained strong. I've been blessed to serve on two circuits where the lay witness movement had a strong impact, and I was in churches where they had a number of small groups. In the Sheffield circuit, I haven't found that to be the case so much, and I'm hoping that we might rekindle that desire. Where they disappeared, where small groups disappeared, churches sometimes became weaker. The question for us is, how are we helping people grow as disciples between Sundays? And then thirdly, trust ordinary people. The expansion of Methodism around the world was rarely driven by bishops or superintendents. It was usually driven by ordinary Christians: sailors, migrants, workers, teachers, local preachers, lay leaders, you name it, anybody other than official leaders. Again and again, the church arrived after the mission had already begun. That is a profoundly Methodist insight. God's mission does not depend primarily on clergy. We're concerned that we have less clergy, but actually the mission of God and the growth of the church has never been dependent on clergy. It depends on the whole people of God playing their part. So the final reflection, I think the most important sentence in this whole lecture is this: the global south is no longer the mission field. It is the centre. Methodism began in Britain, but it no longer belongs to Britain. It belongs to the worldwide people of God. And perhaps the greatest challenge for us today is not asking, what can we teach the world, but rather, what is God teaching us through Methodists in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and beyond? That, I think, is the real so what and the now what of the global Methodist story. God bless, and I'll see you in the next session.